Are we here for a little bit of history repeating when it comes to what's happening in Venezuela? Let's dive into that. Hi, I'm Melba Pearson, also known as the Resident Legal Diva, and this is The Breakdown. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Legal AF for all things politics and legal coming out of this administration. So, had a chat with a friend the other day, and we talked a little bit about what was happening in Venezuela, and Panama suddenly came into the frame when we were talking, and I'm like, wait a minute, there's some overlap here. So I figured I'd dive into it, and y'all let me know what you think, if this is a bit of history repeating or totally different dramas altogether. So, folks may not remember that what's happening now in Venezuela is very similar to a very controversial U.S. intervention that happened 30 years ago. And that was the 1989 U.S. invasion of Panama. The question is whether its lessons or its mistakes are being repeated today. So let's start with setting the stage. In 1989, the entire world watched as the U.S. invaded Panama as part of Operation Just Cause. And now this was a full-scale military invasion. The target, General Manuel Noriega. Now, let's keep in mind, Noriega wasn't just any old dictator. He was a former CIA asset. And then he turned pariah. And then he turned target. He was indicted by U.S. federal juries for drug trafficking and money laundering. So I remember this, again, I talk often about being raised in a Caribbean household, and one of the big things is Caribbean talk radio. Caribbean people live and die by talk radio. So the invasion of Panama, much like the invasion of Grenada, was something that was heavily featured in the backdrop of my growing up. And so, like, wait a minute, some of this is starting to sound like a repeat. So the goals in this invasion, well, the stated goals anyway, were to depose Manuel Noriega, bring him to justice, restore democracy, and protect American lives, and, of course, always follow the money, the vital Panama Canal treaties. So this Operation Just Cause was fast, it was decisive, and by all accounts, I guess if you want to look at it from that perspective, it's a military success, right? Noriega was captured, he was extradited, and democracy eventually returned to Panama. So this operation kind of created what I found in my research, some call the Panama playbook, which is basically a template for dealing with rogue leaders by indicting them criminally and then having decisive violent action, usually military. But is that playbook relevant or even wise for the massive drama that we're seeing in Venezuela right now? So fast forwarding from 1989 to today, you've got Venezuela that's in the middle of one of the worst humanitarian crises in history. We're looking at hyperinflation, widespread poverty. 7 million refugees have fled the country, and a ton of them in my backyard in South Florida. And at the helm of this crisis is Nicolas Maduro, who is the authoritarian leader, whose legitimacy as to whether or not he for real is the president is widely disputed. So the U.S., along with dozens of other countries, have thrown their support behind the democratically elected National Assembly and their leader, Juan Guaido, and they were recognizing him at one point as the interim president. And so the goal of the international community was to pressure Maduro to step down, restore democracy, and alleviate the suffering of the Venezuelan people. Okay. So here's where the parallels start to really come into focus. So just like Noriega, Maduro and many high-ranking officials in his government have been indicted by the U.S. on drug trafficking and narco-terrorism charges. The DOJ says that Maduro leads the cartel of the Suns, which, okay, I still have question about all these presidents that lead cartels. Like, I think that's BS, but okay. Well, I'll just leave it there for the time being. So allegedly, Maduro is conspiring with Colombian terrorist groups to flood the U.S. with cocaine. And they currently have $15 million as a bounty on his head for his arrest. So let's look at these timelines side by side. So you've got Panama. They started to go south, as in things started to get hectic in the mid-'80s. Relations between the U.S. and Panama start to get really bad. Noriega gets indicted in 1988, and then the elections get annulled in 1989. So the trigger here was December 1989, when Noriega decided to declare a state of war, and a U.S. Marine ended up getting killed. So then by December 20th, 1989, Operation Just Cause kicks off. Noriega surrenders a month later. Quick, decisive military victory, bing, bam, boom, and it's a wrap, right? Now let's look at Venezuela. Drama started around 2013 after the last president, Chavez, passed away, and an economic collapse of epic proportions began, right? Just everything started to go downhill. And then, like I said, for someone who lives in South Florida, start to see the rise in Venezuelan refugees, coming in with basically nothing but the clothes on their back, right? So now you have the deterioration. Now, the big trigger for what we're seeing right now in Venezuela is around 2019, right? Where the US and others recognize Guaido. The elections are deeply contested, right? Folks are like, Maduro did all kinds of shade and that he was not legitimately elected. And of course, you have the ongoing economic and political pressure. Folks are hungry. The economy is collapsing. And so now we're at the point of what is an intervention going to look like. We don't have a full-scale invasion at this point, but it's an ongoing escalation. We had sanctions. We had attempts at diplomatic isolation. There was support for the opposition. Now we're seeing more and more warships now in the Caribbean as a result of this drama. We have, I believe, a warship now docked in Trinidad and Tobago, which is a whole other situation why Trinidad getting involved with this. But anywho, we have pressure on Grenada for them to spy on behalf of the U.S., basically, or allow the U.S. to spy from the country of Grenada and be able to spy on Venezuela from there. And so now we're hearing discussions of potential land action, covert operations, which kind of hard for the CIA to conduct a covert operation if the operation is being discussed on Truth Social. But hey, new times, right? New times. I guess covert has a new meaning. But anywho, we have now the potential of covert, not so covert operations on land in Venezuela. And of course, we've had the multiple lethal strikes on suspected narco vessels in the area. Now, again, no evidence has been presented by this administration that those boats contained drugs. We have no evidence that, even collecting the drugs that may have been left behind after the strike, nothing. We literally are just rocking on the administration's word that these, in fact, were narco-terrorists, okay? So we have that. So, again, going back to the comparisons, the result for Panama was clear. Noriega was captured, new government was put in place. However, in Venezuela, the crisis continues to persist. It gets worse, the regime stays in power, and there's no decisive resolution in sight. So the reality is there's no quick fix here. This is just a grinding struggle day after day after day. So folks may be saying, well, if the Panama playbook worked once, why don't we just double down and go hardcore in Venezuela? Well, there's some arguments for and against that. So first off, arguments in favor of intervention. You've got the humanitarian aspect, which is obviously the sheer scale of the suffering of folks are dealing with in Venezuela. Now, is that different from suffering that's going on in other countries? Up for debate. But there is a humanitarian argument to be made. There's also the argument around security and drugs. So, in other words, removing a narco-dictator and disrupt these massive drug trafficking networks. Again, a little questionable to me because the majority of the drugs that are coming into the U.S. are coming in through Mexico, and they're not even coming through that route. So argument a little shaky for me on that one, but be that as it may, again, that is an argument to be made. And then, of course, democracy, upholding democratic principles and supporting the legitimate opposition. Again, hey, Maduro does not seem to be have been democratically elected by his people. So, all right, you're holding on to power. This is not okay. Now, examining the reasons for not intervening and why this is very different than Panama. So first off, intervention could cause a humanitarian catastrophe. So the stated goal would be like, oh, we're going in to help because there's a humanitarian crisis. Yeah, but you also have to make sure in your calculations whether or not you're going to make things worse. So military coming in, that could mean mass casualties. It could mean less supplies for folks. So you could be making the humanitarian situation way worse. You're running the risk of violating the sovereignty of the country of Venezuela, because it's a clear breach of international law just to roll up into a country that you don't have beef with, right? And again, the president is saying that we have a problem with Venezuela because of drug trafficking, and he specifically named fentanyl, but fentanyl doesn't come from Venezuela. So he's giving all these arguments to say, yes, we need to intervene because we have a problem with them. But again, Congress has not declared war, and Venezuela has taken no aggressive action against us as a country. Drug trafficking aside, they have not declared war on the U.S. They have not sent troops to the U.S. They have not started bombing places or got guerrilla groups operating in the U.S., right? And for purposes of discussion, I don't see a guerrilla group and a drug cartel as the same, right? Because their intentions are different. For me, a cartel is looking at this about dollar bills. Cartel want to make money. They want to keep their territory and they want to keep their routes clear so that they can make money. A guerrilla, they're looking for regime change. They're looking to disrupt a country's functioning. And so the intent is totally different. So I see those two groups as not being the same, right? So that's kind of my mindset when it comes from that. And then also just looking again at the violating of the sovereignty of the country of Venezuela. This is something that we've done time after time in Latin America, and countries still remember the drama that they got left with and the cleanup they have to deal with. Like going in and intervening in a country doesn't necessarily leave the country better, right? Especially if you come in, you drop bombs and do all of this, and then you turn around and walk out the door and provide no money for helping with cleanup, helping with infrastructure, right? Like you leave a power vacuum, a la like Iraq, right? And also in Afghanistan, you leave a power vacuum and you don't invest in the rebuilding, you're going to be back in the same situation in very short order. So there's that. Then also you have to think about the feasibility and the risk. So Panama is a tiny country. Noriega's forces, they couldn't handle nothing, right? There weren't a lot of them. Venezuela is a huge country. They sit on some of the world's largest oil reserves. Their military, more entrenched. So this could end up being a bloody, messy urban war. Do we have the bandwidth to even deal with that? And you got to think about the geopolitical aspect of this. So Panama back in 1988-89 was isolated. Like they just out in the cut and they didn't have international support. Venezuela is crew with Russia, China, and Iran. So if we square off seriously against Venezuela, we got 300 other major countries with nuclear power that could jump to Venezuela's defense. So that also has to get in the mix in terms of the calculus of how deep should we get involved with this. And so this brings me to the crucial part of all of this. Are we repeating lessons or are we repeating mistakes? So I submit to you that the ghost of Panama is still haunting us, especially through this temptation of just a quick fix and misreading the current political and just the current environment generally. So, this whole mindset of, if we just remove one bad leader, that solves everything. It doesn't, right? It doesn't. We're seeing this play out in real time in Gaza, right? So we're seeing Hamas being removed as the governing entity, but there's no government ready to step in the interim. So what happens in a power gap? We're seeing this again in real time in Haiti. Their president gets assassinated. Now you got basically their version of Congress has all been term limited out. So there is literally no functioning government. Removing a bad leader doesn't necessarily fix things. You got to make sure that there's some stabilization after the conflict and some nation building. Again, looking at the environment, Panama small and isolated, Venezuela got some backing. So that same playbook can't work. And in Panama, you already had a legitimate, democratically elected alternative ready to rock and roll. Venezuela, not the same, because we're not hearing a lot about Guaido these days. You know, there's different groups and different factions who are like, hey, no, we want to lead. No, we should lead. We're hearing that people that are presently in Maduro's government were trying to make moves to DC, to Washington, DC. Like, listen, like we could be the government if Maduro has to go, right? So you don't have a clear successor once Maduro's out of the picture. So that could lead to a disaster, because then you have all these groups fighting for power, a la Haiti. And then lastly, you got to think about damage to the relationships in the region with the rest of South America and the Caribbean, right? So looking at Panama, even after Noriega was gone, most of the Latin American countries were mad that the US invaded Panama and felt salty about it. And so if we do the same thing in Venezuela, we could risk alienating key regional partners. Already we're seeing the president of the United States beefing with the president of Colombia because he's like, yo, you killed one of my citizens on one of these, vessel strikes. Now the president of the US is like, oh, you're a narco-terrorist. And President of Colombia is like, dude, you give us money to fight the narco-terrorists. Like, we literally use US money to train our troops to be able to execute some of these raids. So if you want to take that money away, okay, fine. But just know you're hurting your stated reason, which is to fight the narco-terrorists. So in this instance, this administration is already pissing off key allies in the area. CARICOM, which is basically the Organization of Caribbean States, they're all mad because they're like, we don't want warships in the Caribbean. We don't want any part of this. We just got to deal with our own stuff. We don't need you. With the exception, again, of the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, who I think is very misguided in hitching her wagon to anything having to do with this presidential administration here in the US. So, just to wrap things up, at the end of the day, there's definitely some parallels between what happened with Noriega back in the 80s and what's happening with Maduro now. And the rhetoric around fighting drug lords and restoring democracy, yeah, sounds similar. But the realities of what we're dealing with now are way different than Panama in 1989. So the key here is not about whether or not we should act, it's how we should act. And also remembering that if you underestimate a complex situation, it's going to be hell to pay and be messy for decades moving forward. So the risk of repeating history's mistakes rather from learning from them is really real. So sound off in the comments. Tell me what you think. Is the Panama playbook a useful guide as to what we're dealing with here, or is it just a distraction? And again, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Legal AF. I'm Melba Pearson, also known as the Resident Legal Diva, and this was The Breakdown. Stay safe, stay informed, and keep demanding justice. Take care.
In collaboration with the Midas Touch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel where I'll be curating the top stories at the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.